Alright guys, so this is going to be our next lesson in plants, and we're going to focus on plant structure and transport. And just to kind of recap what we covered last time we covered just the general characteristics of kingdom Plantae, and then we focused on the different groups of plants like the bryophytes, which were non-vascular, the seedless vascular plants like ferns, and then we had the seed plants, which were your gymnosperms and angiosperms. Now, this particular lesson is going to focus really kind of on plant structures of those more advanced seed plants, because we're going to look at things like vascular tissue, and we're going to look at things like flowers. And so really, these structures would not be for things like the mosses. And even the ferns have their own unique structures. But starting with those seedless vascular plants, we started to see true roots, stems, and leaves, and so a lot of these things would apply to them as well. But some of the more specifics, like the seeds and the flowers and the fruits, would not be included in those lower plant groups. So in general, we're just going to talk about overall plant structure. And something that you may not realize is just like we have this organization, you know, if I asked you to name some organs, you're going to mention things like maybe a liver or a brain or a stomach. But normally when you think about things like organs, you don't necessarily think of plants. We think of the organs that we have as humans or the organs that other animals have. But just like animals have this complex structure where cells make up tissues, which make up organs, which make up organ systems, which make up the organism, plants have this same organization because they are multicellular. And so they're going to have this organization from simpler all the way to more complex. And so in terms of your plants, they have systems just like we do, where we have systems like the circulatory system or the nervous system. Plants primarily have two. They have the root system and the shoot system. The root system is going to comprise the roots and all of those structures that are underground, like the root hairs and the different types of roots. And the main job of the root system is going to be to anchor and absorb and possibly store. And then our shoot system is going to be everything that's above the ground. And so it's going to include organs like the stem and the leaves. If there are flowers on that plant, if there are fruits on that plant, all of those things would be included in the shoot system. And so the organ systems, there's primarily two, and those organ systems are going to be made up of organs. And so when it comes to our plants, there are three basic organs. There are more, like a flower is an organ, a fruit would be an organ, but we're going to focus on just the three basic ones. We have the roots, the stems, and the leaves. And so the roots would be part of that root system, and they have really kind of three main jobs. They anchor the plant and hold it in place, and this is one reason why roots are really good at preventing erosion. They can come in different types, like a taproot with these extensions, or it could be a fibrous root. We looked at that a little bit with monocots and dicots. A second function of roots is they are our absorbers. So this is where the water and the nutrients from the soil are going to be taken in by the plant. And then they could also be storage units. So they could store sugars, or they could store starches, which are sugar storage, big polysaccharides, or that are made up of many sugar molecules. So sometimes our roots could be our food stores. The second main organ is going to be your stems, which your stems are going to be part of the structure of the plant. They're going to help display those leaves, and so those leaves are going to be all about photosynthesis, and so they need to be displayed so that they can catch sunlight. And then the stems are going to be a major highway between the root system and the rest of the shoot system. So water and nutrients are going to be transported through the stem in that vascular tissue from leaves to roots and roots to leaves and other parts of the plant. And then the leaves themselves are going to be your main photosynthetic centers. They are designed so that they can capture sunlight. They're filled with chloroplast and chlorophyll. And so that's where your main metabolic activity is going to be taking place, is in the leaves. And then also present in the leaves are little tiny holes that allow for gas exchange. And so we know that the plant needs carbon dioxide for photosynthesis. It also releases oxygen in photosynthesis. And then just like we do cell respiration, so do the plants. So we're going to have an exchange of those gases, carbon dioxide and oxygen, and that's going to occur through these little tiny holes on the underside of leaves. Now those organs are going to be made up of 4 major tissue types. And so we have 3 on this slide. We're going to talk about the 4th one here in a minute. But the first tissue type is called dermal tissue, and that word may sound familiar because we have dermal tissue. In fact, we have an epidermis, and we have a dermis, and we have a hypodermis. And the derm means skin. Okay, so the dermal tissue is kind of like the skin of the plant. It's going to be the outer layer of living cells, and that outer layer is known as the epidermis. And then sometimes on your shoot parts, like your leaves and your stems, this is not a living tissue, but sometimes on the outside of that epidermis will be a waxy cuticle. And that cuticle is meant to kind of protect from pathogens and keep things from getting into those living cells, and also help for water retention. This is going to be one of those adaptations that you'll see if you have plants that are in drier areas. They're going to have a very thick cuticle. And if you look at leaves, a lot of times you can see that waxy coating on the outside. So the actual tissue is known as the dermal tissue or the epidermis, but there might be a cuticle on the outside of that, which is not living. It's just a lipid type of molecule. Now you won't find the cuticle on the leaves, on the roots, because remember that the cuticle is waxy. It's a lipid, so it repels water, and we want the roots to absorb water. So that cuticle is just going to be on the shoot system. Our next type of tissue is something that we've mentioned whenever we were doing our plant diversity. We classified our plants based on whether or not they contained vascular tissue. And so in this lesson, we're going to talk a lot more in detail about this vascular tissue. And we actually have vascular tissue as well. In fact, we have a system that is known as the cardiovascular system. Now, the cardio refers to heart, and the vascular refers to the vessels. We have arteries and veins and capillaries. And the job of our cardiovascular system is to transport materials all throughout our body. And so in the plant, it's going to be the same way. Your vascular tissue, or your vessels, they could be called vascular bundles or veins, but these vessels, their main job is going to be to transport. And we have 2 major types of vascular tissue, and that's going to be your xylem and your phloem. The xylem carries water, and the phloem carries food. I try to remember food because it has a similar sound. So the xylem carries water, and the phloem carries food, or the sugars. And we'll talk a little bit more in detail about the transport at the end of our notes today. All right, now the third type of tissue is ground tissue, and I just want you to think of this like the filler. So we have dermal on the outside here. All of this is dermal tissue. And then on the inside, and these could be arranged in different ways, but on the inside you have these vessels or these veins, which would be your vascular tissue, and then everything in between would be your ground tissue. And so it's the stuff that's in the middle. Now, depending on what structure you're looking at, you could see the pith and the cortex. So let's say we had multiple vascular bundles here. The center innermost portion would be the pith, and then the cortex would be the portion outside. So in your dicots, the vascular bundles are in rings, and so inside of that ring would be the pith, and outside of those rings would be the cortex. So here's kind of some examples. You have the dermal tissue on the outside. That would be your epidermis. We're going to take a look at the cells that make up our ground tissue here in a moment. So there's different types of ground tissue depending on what part of the plant you're in. And then your vascular tissue, once again, is your xylem and phloem for transport. And you can see that they definitely have different structures to them. They also have different directions of transport. Now the fourth main type of tissue is known as meristematic, or you could just call them the meristems. And I want you to remember that meristems equal mitosis. Really, it's cell division or the cell cycle, but the meristems are where we have growth. So these are embryonic tissues where the cells are going through the cell cycle, and they are dividing by mitosis and cytokinesis to make more cells for growth. Okay. Now we have three types of meristems. We have apical, and that comes from the word apex, which means at the tip or like the top. So your apical meristems are at the tips of roots and shoots, and this is going to allow for what we call primary growth. So you're going to have an apical meristem up here, and that's going to allow for the plant to grow taller. And then if we had roots in our picture, there would also be apical meristems at the tips of the roots, and that would allow for growth to go longer and deeper down into the soil. So your apical meristems are where you see lots of mitosis. And just to connect this to our first semester, when we covered mitosis, one of the labs that you did was you looked at mitosis in onion root tips. And you had to go to the tip of the root in order to see all of those different stages of mitosis, the prophase, metaphase, anaphase, and telophase. And so what you were looking at was an apical meristem when you were looking at the tip of that root. Now, most of your plants are going to demonstrate what's called apical dominance because the plant really needs sunlight. And so it's going to have to be able to collect light in order to get food. So typically your plants are going to focus more on primary growth and getting taller, which is what we call the apical dominance, so that way they can get more sunlight. Now another type of meristem are lateral meristems, and the word lateral means side. So these are going to be on the sides of stems and roots. And this is how they grow in width, which is called secondary growth. And I want you to think about tree rings, okay? So like you can see here in your dicots, because those vascular bundles are arranged in rings, as they build new xylem and phloem, it creates those ring structures as the tree gets bigger and wider over time. And so that kind of growth is going to occur at lateral meristems. And there could also be these intercalary meristems, which are going to be along the stem, and they could allow for growth around the nodes or the leaves. And we'll take a look at what these structures are here shortly. All right, so we've taken a look at two major plant systems. We looked at three major organs, four major tissues, and now we're going to look at some cell types. Now these are not the only cell types. These are specifically some cell types that you'll find in the ground tissue, that filler tissue. Each of your plant parts are going to have their own specialized cells. Like your xylem and phloem have specialized cells in them to help them transport. Your roots may have some specialized cells in order to absorb. Your leaves are going to have some specialized cells in order to do photosynthesis. So these are just three examples of some cell types that you can find in plants, but it's specifically the ground tissue. And we'll come across some other specialized cells as we go throughout other plant parts. And so we have parenchyma, collenchyma, and sclerenchyma. And so the parenchyma, these are your most abundant. These are the ones that are going to be doing a lot of photosynthesis. So I try to connect the parenchymal cells with photosynthesis. They are living cells. They are very flexible. They're going to be found in all of the soft parts of the plants. There's a lot of these in the leaves, and then we might find them like in the middle of possibly the stems. But you're going to find them where you have active living cells. And what they're going to be doing is storing things like sugars or water, and they are very highly metabolic, which means they're doing lots of chemical reactions. So the majority of your cells are going to be your parenchymal cells. Now the next type, your collenchymal cells, are going to be also living, and we're going to find these in areas where the plant is growing. So they're going to be kind of around those apical meristems or those lateral meristems. They're going to be in the areas that are going through that cell division. They do have thicker cell walls than the parenchymal cells, but they're kind of unevenly thickened. So they are going to allow for some support as well as flexibility as those new plant parts grow. And then your sclerenchyma are dead cells. As they mature, they are no longer living and they are no longer active, and they are very hard and rigid with very thick cell walls. They have this stuff in them called lignin, which makes them very, very tough. You'll find that in woody tissue. You'll find it in vascular bundles, especially around the xylem, because the xylem is what forms that woody tissue. The old xylem kind of becomes hardened. You also find it in hard parts like the seed shells or things like that. So just remember that parenchyma needs to be connected to photosynthesis, collenchyma needs to be connected to growing, and sclerenchyma needs to be connected to mature old plant parts. All right, now the rest of our lesson on structure is going to just focus on some additional parts of parts, or maybe some additional organs that we didn't mention before. So we're just going to start with the roots. Now, there are different types of roots. If you are looking at a dicot has what's called a taproot system. And so a taproot has a primary root. This is the main root that grows downward from the seed, from what's called the radicle. And then from the primary root, you'll have some extensions called lateral roots, and they extend out to the side. And anytime you have extensions or foldings, it's all about increasing surface area, okay? So by having these lateral roots, it's going to help to kind of disperse those roots and take up more surface area to increase absorption. And so these lateral roots could be secondary or tertiary, so the first, second, and then third branches. And then some other things that you'll find on your roots are root hairs. And once again, this is all about increasing surface area. So these are little tiny hairy structures towards the ends of those roots. And then a root cap is kind of like a hard hat. Now remember that at the tip of this root, okay, see this right here is called the region of cell division. So this right here would be your apical meristem. And what's happening here is we're making new little baby cells. And so this root, as it grows, is going to push downward through the soil. And so if we were to push these little baby cells down into the soil without protection, they would just get crushed. And so at the very tip of the root is something called a root cap. And it's just a hardened structure that protects that apical meristem, and it helps that root push downward through the soil and the rocky material. All right, our next organ that we're going to take a look at are leaves. And so leaves have their own special parts. And something I want you to understand is that depending on what kind of plant you're looking at, there could be modifications to all of these. So we're just kind of talking about your basic roots, your basic leaves, your basic stems. But depending on what kind of plant you're looking at, they could have some modified versions that have unique functions and things like that. Your leaves are, for the most part, going to have big, wide, flat blades. And they have this big surface area for light collection. These are your megaphylls that were one of your evolutionary developments that we looked at in the last lesson. And so by developing these big flat leaves or megaphylls, it increases photosynthesis in that plant. The petiole is the little stem that actually attaches to the stem itself. So it's the little stalk that attaches to the big stem of the plant. Inside of the leaf, you have a mesophyll tissue. And so all of this over here, so it's going to be this ground tissue between the dermal tissue. And so in this particular ground tissue, we have a lot of those parenchymal cells. We have a palisade parenchyma and spongy parenchyma. And these are going to be your highly metabolic cells. They're going to have lots of chloroplasts and lots of chlorophyll. We're going to have a lot of photosynthesis going on in this particular region of the leaf. Another really important part of plants are the stomata. Now, the stoma is one, and stomata is plural, I believe. And so these are actually not a structure, but they're holes. They're little openings. Okay, so you can see there's a little gap there. And on the underside of leaves, you have these stomata that are going to be open sometimes and closed other times. Now, what determines that are these guard cells that surround them. And depending on moisture levels and humidity and wind and all different factors, if these guard cells take on water, they will buckle and open. And if they lose water, they will kind of expand and close. And so these guard cells are going to control the opening and closing of stomata. Now, we need the stomata open because that's where the oxygen and carbon dioxide is going to be exchanged. But we also have an issue in that when the stomata are opened, that's where transpiration can happen. So your plants have to find a balance of keeping those stomata open so that they can exchange gases, but not keeping them open too much so that they lose too much water. All right, our next plant part is going to be the stem. And once again, you could have modified versions. Not all stems are created equal. But in general, your stems are going to have nodes and internodes. The nodes are going to be the points of attachment for leaves and branches and flowers. And then the internodes are just the spaces in between. You're going to have buds, which are going to be the new tissues where it could sprout out to be a new leaf or a new branch or a new flower. You could have an apical bud, which is at the end. And once again, a lot of plants will demonstrate apical dominance and they'll focus on that one bud. But there could also be axillary, which are kind of between that petiole and the stem. Sometimes these will be promoted to grow under certain conditions, but normally the focus is going to be up here on that apical bud. And then your stems are the areas that may develop that woody tissue. And once again, as we lay new vascular tissue, that old xylem becomes very hardened. It's going to contain that sclerenchymal tissue, and it's going to be very, very hardened and tough, and that's what actually forms the layers of the wood. One thing that we haven't talked about yet in terms of plants are flowers. And so notice that a flower is a specialized organ, and it's all about reproduction. Of course, the flower is unique to the angiosperms, and we'll take a closer look at flowers when we talk about plant reproduction. But the flower has a lot of unique parts that allow it to reproduce successfully. So you have the sepals, which kind of, when you look at a flower bud, the sepals are the little modified leaves that surround that bud. And so when the flower blooms, those sepals kind of open up. A lot of times they're green and leaf-like, but sometimes they actually look like the petals too. So we're going to see that in a flower that we dissect after spring break. The petals are usually the colorful or the smelly parts, and the petals are all about attracting. They are pretty or they smell, and they can smell good or bad, but the purpose of the petals is to attract pollinators to increase variety in reproduction. And then we have the male and female parts. We have the stamen and either the carpel or the pistil. I've been teaching biology for many years, and I couldn't just off the top of my head tell you the exact difference between a carpel and a pistil. I've looked it up multiple times, but as far as I'm concerned, these words are interchangeable. So the stamen, one thing I want to point out is it has the word men in it. Okay, so that's the male part. And the stamen consists of the filament, which the filament pretty much just holds up the anther. And the anther is going to be the important part because that's where your pollen is produced. And if you go back to our last lesson where we covered alternation of generations, the male producing gametophyte was known as the antheridia. So the anther is going to be the pollen producer or the gamete producer of our flower. And then we have the female part. Now the female part has three parts to it. Okay, so this whole thing here is the carpel or the pistil. Up at the very top, you have a sticky stigma, and that's where the pollen is going to stick in order to initiate reproduction. So the pollinators could drop it off, or the wind could blow the pollen onto the sticky stigma. And then that's going to cause a pollen tube to form down this long stalk known as the style. So the style is just kind of the stalk between the stigma and the ovary. And that's where the pollen tube is going to form as that sperm travels down to the ovary. Now at the very bottom, this whole structure here is the ovary. Remember that the ovary is what becomes the fruit. And inside of the ovary are the little ovules. And once fertilized, they are what will become the seeds. And so remember, the purpose of the fruit is to protect the seeds that are inside of it. And then a couple other parts. We have the receptacle, which is just where all the flower parts come together and they attach to the stalk, known as the pedicle. Okay. All right, so that takes care of your main plant structures. And then to finish off these notes, we just have a little bit about plant transport. Now, a lot of this is just a review of beginning of the year when we talked about the cell membrane. We talked about many different types of cell transport. And when we're talking about transport in plants, we pretty much utilize all of them. So we're going to see examples of passive transport where things are moving high to low without energy. We're going to see examples of active transport where things are moving low to high, and that requires energy and pumps. Sometimes you could have co-transport Whereas one thing flows downhill, it powers the pumping uphill. Osmosis is going to be very important in plant transport, which is just that diffusion of water. Remember that anytime there's a difference in concentration, wherever there's more solute, water will follow. Remember that salt sucks, solute sucks. And in the cell membrane are specialized proteins called aquaporins that allow for the water to easily move across the membrane. And then another type of transport that we're going to see that we haven't really talked about before is bulk flow. And this is where you have a high pressure, low pressure, and that creates a flow over a long distance. And this is what's going to happen in our xylem and phloem. So we're going to take a look at specifically the types of transport that are happening in the xylem and the phloem. And so we're going to take a look at water transport first. Now, as we know, hopefully, water is moved in the xylem. And there's three major mechanisms that are going to allow water to move upward. Now, this is the key. In the xylem, the water is always moving up, okay? Anytime you see pictures of xylem, the arrows are always going upward, okay? So this is a one direction type of movement. And the reason why is because water is only absorbed down in the roots, okay? So we have three mechanisms that are going to help move water upward. And if you think about it, defying gravity is not an easy task. We have to get water and nutrients from the roots all the way up to the very top of a tall tree, or all the way to the top of the plant. And so it's not always easy to move upward because you're going against that gravitational pull. So you're going to have some mechanisms that allow it to go against gravity. And so we have three mechanisms. We have root pressure, capillary action, and transpiration. And this creates what I like to call a push, a climb, and a pull. Now, with root pressure, remember the roots are what are absorbing water. And what happens down in the roots is that you get the nutrients and minerals that the plant needs. They are pumped in by active transport. And we know that solutes suck. So once those solutes get pumped into the roots, what will happen is water will passively flow in after them by osmosis. And so the water flowing into the roots creates a push. Okay, as the water moves in, it pushes water up. Now, the second mechanism is called capillary action. And way back in the beginning of the year, we learned that water is sticky. Water demonstrates these properties of cohesion and adhesion. So water is not only going to stick to water, that's cohesion, but water also sticks to other things, and that's adhesion. So water will naturally climb tubes. Okay, that's called capillary action. And it's because of the stickiness of water. It sticks to itself and it sticks to the sides of the plant vessels, so it will naturally climb those vessels. Okay, so there's our push and there's our climb. And then the third mechanism is a pull, and this is known as transpirational pull. Now, transpiration is the evaporation of water from the leaves. This is happening at those stomata on the underside of our leaves. And so as those water molecules evaporate, they're kind of pulling on or creating a suction for those water molecules that are behind them. So that creates a negative pressure. So we have a positive pressure going into the roots, and we have a negative pressure due to evaporation at the leaves. And so that creates the pull, and it will pull the water molecules upward. So water is always moving up by a push, a pull, and a climb. Now with sugars, it's a little bit different because sugars are moving in the phloem, and we describe sugar transport as source to sink, okay? So sugars are going to be moved where they're made, which is typically going to be the leaves, to where they are stored, which is usually fruits or roots. Now, sometimes this could be modified leaves or modified stems like a potato or a bulb, but in general, your sinks are going to usually be fruits or roots, okay? But there are some other examples where you could have some sugar sinks. Now, the sugar in these, in the leaves, they're going to be actively loaded. So we're going to have some active transport. The sieve tubes are some specialized structures in the phloem. So the sugars are going to get actively transported into sieve tubes. And as we've already seen, solutes suck. And so whenever the sugars get pumped into the phloem, we can see that water is going to flow in, okay? Now, when the water flows in, that's going to create a positive pressure. Well, when we get to the sink, in this case, your sink would be a root, those sugars get unloaded. And once again, water is going to follow the sugars. And so now the water is going to leave the phloem, and that's going to create a negative pressure. And what happens is when you have a positive on one end and a negative on the other end, it creates a flowing mechanism. Okay, so if you've ever seen someone like siphon gas or empty an aquarium by kind of taking a tube or a water hose or something and sticking it in, you create a suction, and that water will just keep on flowing and keep on flowing, and it's all because of changes in pressure. We have a positive pressure on one end and a negative pressure on the other end. And that is going to wrap up our second set of notes on plants. Over the next couple of days, you guys are going to be working on just some plant review activities, looking at some plant parts, and then I hope you guys have a great spring break. I hope you get lots of rest, and we will pick up with our plant unit when you return. Hope you guys are doing well, and just let me know if you need me. Have a good day.